Whenever a series of games lasts long enough, it's dang near inevitable for a black sheep to crop up within the crowd, one that isn't liked as much as the others for one reason or another. Boy oh boy, the Flame Wars, I could start with that. Like Paper Mario, am I right? I kid, these kinds of games come in a lot of flavors, and generally I tend to avoid them out of a lack of interest, though some of them still haunt me at night because I am never getting the hours spent on those games back. Out of all of them though, I can't help but feel different about Star Fox Zero. Okay, I'll be honest, for the longest time I wasn't a fan of Star Fox, but when I finally gave 64 a shot, I loved it. It's rough around the edges for sure, but the frantic gameplay and fun cast of characters with a light amount of story and a ton of replayability made this stand the test of time as a true classic among my favorites on the N64. If you're new to the series and want a good place to start, then 64 is a no-brainer. But it isn't exactly a hot take to say Star Fox 64 is a good game since practically everyone is in agreement about the matter. Shocker, right? Star Fox Zero, on the other hand? There's something about this game that really grinded people's gears at launch to an unreasonable degree, I think. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about Star Fox Zero, why people hated it, and why I think it's nowhere near as bad as it's made out to be. Now where else should we start than with the point at which complaints began, the story. Star Fox Zero follows space pilot Fox McCloud, leader of the elite fighter squadron Star Fox, working together with the Cornerian Army's General Pepper to fight against Andross's empire, which appeared out of nowhere, launching a full-scale attack on Corneria's capital. So it's Star Fox's job to fight back, defeat Andross, and maybe this time finally figure out why his father left him. The problem a lot of people had with the story is that it was the third retelling of the original Star Fox's plot, or even the fourth if you count 64 3D, which I don't know why you would, but you know. Star Fox has tried hard with some of its stories, but if Star Fox Adventures and Assault are anything to show for it, it's clear that not many people like that kind of direction, and perhaps it's an unfair argument, as I'm not entirely familiar with those games' stories myself, but I've never seen the appeal of a story in a Star Fox game anyway, regardless of their quality in writing, because you're coming to the series for the gameplay, not some furry bait material. Okay, I'll admit, that was a low-hanging fruit. This isn't to say that they shouldn't ever try anything different with a Star Fox story, but that it's not a necessity to make a good game, especially considering Star Fox games are arcadey at heart. The simple story of Star Fox works because it's what drives you from one stage to the next, keeping that moment-to-moment gameplay going with little distraction. Now believe me, I am open to them trying something different, focusing on a new threat or something else entirely, just so long as it doesn't detract from the gameplay. Star Fox Zero's story doesn't matter much to the overall experience, and I'm okay with that because it didn't matter much to me in Star Fox 64 either. Despite my stance on the stories though, I've always loved the character interactions we get in this series. Your co-pilots serve to help you progress through each mission by defeating the occasional enemy or two, or more likely they'll yell at you for shooting one of their enemies, even though I was just doing my job, Slippy. Get over it! We all have a job to do, so if you wanted to defeat them, then maybe you should have been focusing on that instead of trying to come up with a lame quip to make yourself seem cool. Anyway, the main cast is great per the usual. I loved the banter between these four, especially Slippy and Falco.
Come on, Falco, talk some sense into it or something!
Right, because I'm a bird, we must be friends. Come on!
Slippy, you may be stupid, but... Actually, no, you're just stupid. Lovably stupid, though, I'll give you that much. Playing 64 and Zero back-to-back really shows just how refined the series has gotten over the years. From what I've played of the games, this is dang near the best it's felt. A problem I frequently had in Star Fox 64 was getting damaged fairly easily by accident because aiming is tied to R-wing movement. Meanwhile in Star Fox Zero, you can move and aim at the same time, which makes it a lot easier to get by with less accidental damage. They aren't just good for that though. I felt like I could actually hit more targets in Zero because of the motion controls. Star Fox 64 3D had motion controls as well, but they didn't feel quite as responsive as they do in Zero. The motion controls aren't perfect though, and they do have their occasional issues, but personally that only happened briefly in the Landmaster stages. But there is another pretty big addition to the control scheme that wasn't present in any prior games. By default, the TV displays a traditional view, much like any other Star Fox game, while the Wii U gamepad shows your cockpit view. No, No, how am I supposed to look at both screens at the same time? Let me let you in on a little bit of a big gamer tip. You don't have to. I have seen so many people in reviews claiming the game forces you to constantly look back and forth between your TV and the gamepad, which just isn't true for a majority of the game. Though there are a few parts of the game where switching your view to the gamepad is necessary, like the target mode boss fights. Target mode basically allows you to lock onto bosses and other enemies, which can be an incredibly useful tool, especially for the Star Wolf fights, but a few bosses force it on you with no option to opt out. And I'll admit, this was a problem. There is no excusing this, not only because it's unnecessary, but I don't think forcing people into it is the best way of teaching players how it can be helpful. I'd say target mode is most useful for finding the position of a boss. There's no point in the game where I'd say you need to lock onto a particular boss constantly because it hinders your ability to aim. Yes, the cockpit view helps, but it's not a perfect solution. While there is definitely a learning curve to getting used to the controls, however, I wouldn't say they're clunky or outright bad because of that. The main problem for me comes in the execution in the target mode boss fights, but otherwise, I don't really see an issue with this control scheme. In regular gameplay, outside of the bosses, you only ever need to look down at the gamepad in a few specific instances with the Hydro Wing. And even if you absolutely refuse to look down at the gamepad, you can press select to swap the gamepad screen with the TV screen. The game never tells you this, by the way, and I don't understand why. It seems like an awfully important thing to neglect to mention. I think a lot of people were apprehensive towards the controls because of target mode, which I can understand because I was as well initially, but if you take the time to learn and understand the controls, the gamepad screen helps a lot more with aiming than you'd think. That might sound contradictory to what I was saying earlier, but other than one outlier, the target mode bosses aren't that bad once you've given them a few fair shakes. Even then, there's not very many of them, so for the most part, the option to target is just that, optional. I can understand having a few gripes here and there, but people acted as though the controls ran over their dog. There are a few issues with the execution, but overall I think Star Fox Zero benefits a lot from the new control scheme since I found it easier than ever to actually hit enemies and bosses with the motion controls. I'm not about to spend all day talking about the controls though, so how's the gameplay? Well, Star Fox Zero is about as classic of a Star Fox game as you can get, but with some little tweaks here and there to modernize the experience. The gameplay is segmented into a few different styles. You've got the classic on-rails gameplay, all-range mode, which lets you fly around freely to fight bosses or groups of enemies, and a couple of different vehicle levels as well. Returning are the Landmaster and the Walker from Star Fox 2, and boy oh boy do I not like the Landmaster very much. I think it mostly comes down to the level design and not necessarily the vehicle itself, but it does have a few of its own problems. In Titania, the Landmaster's shot reticle would sometimes not listen to my inputs, and trying to fight with it while having to remember to get out of the way of any incoming enemy fire or hazards got a bit frustrating at times. Thankfully, the Landmaster has a new alternate form to help combat this, the Gravmaster. This allows you to hover in the air for as long as your boost lasts, but even that didn't help Titania too much. You have to use the Landmaster for one other level, but I didn't mind it as much there since it's an all-range level and its alternate form is a lot more helpful there. Though the existence of the Landmaster is brought into question when you realize that the Walker is back. For the uninitiated, in Star Fox 2, the Walker acted as a transformation for the R-Wing, and it's functionally the same in Star Fox Zero other than having a limited hover ability as well as the ability to hack these green monitors. I really came to love the change of pace that brought to the levels it appeared in, and if there's any way to implement ground-based combat in a Star Fox game, it's definitely through the Walker. The Walker has a lot more maneuverability that not only makes it more reliable than the Landmaster, but more enjoyable too, since you can switch to the R-Wing if need be. This isn't me saying the Landmaster is a terrible vehicle though, but to me in Star Fox Zero it's just a slower R-Wing. Anything that the Landmaster can do, the R-Wing can do much better, faster, and in a more enjoyable way, provided it has the Walker transformation. And in the context of the plot, Fox has no reason to use the Landmaster anyway, but they could still easily justify the Landmaster's inclusion in future games by having Fox's R-Wing get totaled, or just any anything better than him just using it because he can. And lastly, we have the most forgettable vehicle, the Hydro Wing. The Hydro Wing is a much slower vehicle since it's used for a stealth mission where you have to hack terminals to disable spotlights, shields, and open a few gates by dropping down this little droid dude. It's an interesting change of pace, but much like with the Landmaster, it's a lot more fun to just use the R-Wing. Funnily enough, there is a separate version of the first Hydro Wing level where you use the R-Wing, which I ended up preferring a lot more since it not only brought in a new challenge, but was a lot faster paced, which is what I personally enjoy the most about Star Fox. The R-Wing in Zero has the best balance of quicker and slower paced gameplay to the point where I have to question the addition of the Hydro Wing. I'm all for variety in gameplay and mechanics, but the Hydro Wing feels a little redundant since the Walker gains the ability to hack terminals later in the game, so when revisiting older levels, you can completely avoid having to use the Hydro Wing at all. Star Fox has almost always had replay value as one of its core appeal factors. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Star Fox 64 is made vastly better with its extra alternate routes, and following along with the trend, Star Fox Zero has just as much, if not more, replay value. Revisiting the game left me surprised at the sheer amount of extra missions and boss fights you could encounter. There's a ton to do here for sure. And something that definitely helped my curiosity was the addition of a mission select menu. While I think it's a little unfortunate that there's no mode allowing you to play through the entire campaign in one sitting, I loved having the mission select as it makes it much easier to discover each of the alternate paths. I don't have much to say about the extra missions themselves though. They are some solid and fun changes of pace, especially the alternate Hydro Wing level and the bonus Starwolf dogfight missions. And while we're on that note, the dogfights are some of my favorite parts of the entire game. No joke, the high speed, high thrill tension these missions gave me was incredibly exhilarating. The members of Starwolf are all incredibly talented pilots, much more so than your own teammates, which makes you question why you're fighting with them to begin with, but nonetheless, that makes the Starwolf encounters a whole lot different from your standard boss fight. These guys will chase you down relentlessly, and in their extra dogfights, they'll have special weapons they fling at you, so targeting and somersaults or U-turns are your best friends here. Starwolf's battle theme puts your encounters with them on a whole other level too. Like, if I could hear this performed in a live orchestra, I think I could die right then and there and be happy with myself. My favorite encounter has to be the last battle where it's you versus all 4 Starwolf pilots, but this time you're on your own. Starwolf, even with your co-pilots, can be a difficult bunch, but all 4 of them on your own makes for an especially taxing and long fight, but man, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying as freaking heck to whittle each member down and finally defeat them. All around, Starwolf has some incredibly fun and well-executed dogfights, so what about the rest of the game's bosses? I liked pretty much all of the bosses for similar reasons to the Starwolf encounters, 2 of my favorites being a Big Bird and a Funny Monkey. The Gorilla is probably my favorite out of the bunch though, because it's the kind of boss fight you might expect to see in any other game. That, and I just love bosses that expect you to switch from the R-Wing to the Walker. It gives off a really daunting perspective whenever you realize just how big some of these robots are. Although it is a little weird to see that all of the bosses in Star Fox Zero are in all range mode as opposed to the typical on-rails bosses, it's not necessarily an issue. Heck, I think I enjoyed the bosses more because of that, but it's a shame to see that there weren't at least 1 or 2 on-rails bosses. Star Fox Zero remains as one of my favorite Wii U titles, and to this day I think it's a shame that this series hardly gets revisited these days. My thoughts on Zero are pretty much unchanged from when I first played it though. Honestly, I thought I would end up disliking the game more due to its control scheme, but if anything I liked it quite a bit more because of that. Star Fox Zero gives you more freedom to move around without aiming being tied to movement, unlike the older titles which didn't have motion controls. It certainly takes some time to get used to, but I think it's a shame more people didn't try to understand the controls better, because once you get past that, you're left with one of the best games in the Star Fox series. Okay, well maybe it's unfair for me to make that claim given I've only played about 4 of the games at this point, but I kinda doubt Star Fox Assault or Adventures will change my mind. Star Fox Zero was somewhat misunderstood because even with the issues I have like the Hydro Wing gameplay being one note and fairly boring, the Landmaster being unnecessary, none of that is enough for me to think any less of its better elements. The mission variety, the bosses, especially the Starwolf encounters, not to mention the extra and alternate missions, and the presentation as well. Like, dude, this game is gorgeous. All of these things personally make up for any of the game's shortcomings, and I really do hope that one day we'll get to see another Star Fox game, even if it is the 450-second retelling of the original's plot, but in the meantime, there's plenty to catch up on and revisit. Oh yeah, this game also came pre-packaged with Star Fox Guard, which I completely forgot about until now. I kinda doubt anyone else remembers it either. Wait a second, this game has security cameras! This is just like FNAF! I can't believe they ripped it off! That's it, I changed my mind. Star Fox Zero sucks. Hi, in case you couldn't tell, that was in fact sarcasm and a joke. Also, thank you for watching. If you're still here, please subscribe and goodbye.